One of the most defining points of the 20th century would be the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Coming as a mere opposition to the provisional government at the time, the Bolsheviks would later start a counter-revolution in protest of the provisional government's continuation of the First World War.
Lenin would champion his peace, land, and war in order to rally the people against the failing President Alexander Kerensky. Lenin would later fight a civil war against Admiral Alexander Kolchak, beating the naval expert in a land war like most would expect, not to mention the overwhelming odds against Kolchak, such as the lack of popular support and the lack of a central leadership, as nobody really wanted to work with Kolchak. This would seal the fate of the White Movement as the Red Army stormed deep into Siberia, down into Central Asia. This would bring 69 years of Soviet rule over Russia until the eventual collapse of the Union and the creation of the Russian Federation. But what if Red rule never came over Russia? What if the Bolsheviks never rose to power like they had in our timeline? Well, this timeline would change with the Russians who sent Lenin into Russia. Many of the government officials already worried that sending Lenin into Russia would not only destabilize Russia, but maybe even the rest of war-torn Europe. So let's say that in this timeline, the Germans had decided against that idea and thought it might cause a couple uprisings. In this timeline, without the leadership of Lenin, the provincial government wouldn't be challenged by any strong figurehead. There would be some resistance in that of the socialists, communists, and anarchists, with more Soviets popping up across Russia, but in this timeline, President Kerensky would open up a creation for new political parties. This would cause a little more unity across the nation as they finally got to choose who they wanted to lead them. We can imagine the government to be slightly diverse among many parties, but I can imagine it rallying together into three coalitions like a European country would today, and did back then. It most likely divided among the conservatives, liberals, and maybe even the socialists, with the socialists having a very, very deep minority. Kerensky might try and put off a presidential election, claiming that they need to set up how a president will be elected, when really he's just trying to buy time until the war ends, and when the armistice would be created, which wouldn't be too far away. But now is to bring up the Tsar question. The Tsar most likely would have his fate put up to a Duma vote, which wouldn't go well for him, as the liberals didn't really see a purpose for him anymore since he tried to dissolve the Duma a couple years ago. The socialists would obviously hate him, and the conservatives, mostly being from Central Asia and the far east of Siberia, would also not like a Tsar ruling over them. So they'd all most likely to vote to exile the Tsar at the very least. After solving the Tsar issue, they would begin to enjoy the spoils of the First World War, as they would most likely set up a puppet state of Poland, taking German earnings, and maybe even create a puppet state of Prussia, as a big screw you to the Germans. Maybe even founding an East Prussian Republic as humiliation tactics. But Russia would also have greater influence into the Balkans, as it just saved its ally of Serbia. Also, it would also maybe even create some type of secondary Balkan League that would align against the newly formed Yugoslavia, which they worried might create an imbalance. In the Middle East, we can see an occupation of the Bosporus, along with a setup of an Armenian state of some kind. The Ataturk revolution would most likely fail in this timeline, as a Russian incursion would spell failure for the revolution, causing a far smaller Turkish state, and maybe even some type of puppet Ottoman state, who knows, but we'd still see the Greek and Italian colonies take the coasts. The Russian Republic would most likely look east, supporting the Chinese national government's fight against the warlords. This could also cause a lot of tension between Imperial Japan, as a massive military buildup would begin around Vladivostok, making the Japanese less kind to the new republic. A greater rise in industrialization would begin as the eastern threat would become more and more real, with Japan arming themselves even greater. This wouldn't be Stalinist mass industrialization like we saw in our timeline, but more of a realistic gradual growth. Meanwhile, around the world, Britain would see this new Russia as a non-threat, as it had almost zero imperialist ambitions at this point, as it was trying to work on reconstruction after the war, along with reform to the government. France would want to mend a new relationship with this government, as it was just like how they overthrew their monarch and made themselves a republic. Meanwhile, America wouldn't really care about this republic, as it was still barely growing, and America, was doing its whole isolationist thing. This would ask the question if the Red Scare happens here. With no Soviet Russia, there would be no irrational fear of communism, so communist ideas might be even more widespread than ever. Without an encompassing threat from the East with a radical ideology, we never see the similar dashes to the opposite ends of the political spectrum like we did in our timeline. Germany was in a strange place as there is no aforementioned danger in the East. Hitler could not thrive in a world where there wasn't communism being demonized by the general populations, so he couldn't really attempt to use these strategies. He would most likely try and promote ethnic purity, but it wouldn't be as popular as not many Germans in our timeline really supported him on those claims. But Germany was still in a desperate time, and poorly structured Weimar Republic would not last. Instead, many workers' organizations would formulate mass strikes following the election of Hindenburg, and after the burning down of the Reichstag, armed militant groups would take this opportunity for change. Just as in the days of the Russian Revolution, Berlin communes would pump up left and right, with armed militant groups attacking the Freikorps. After the death of Hindenburg, many officials would flee fearing political persecution, as prominent socialist figures would rise up and take over major parts of Germany, causing a fleeing of the Weimar Republic and an establishment of the new German Socialist Republic. European nations would become hostile towards the new Germany, causing the League of Nations to expel it and sanction it. Meanwhile, Russia and France would have a more loving approach, as it would see this new Germany as an ally against the ever-growing threat of the British. France, Russia, and Germany would try and counter British influence, leaving the League of Nations themselves, claiming that it was only a way to establish British hegemony. Britain would feel alienated and warm up to Italy and Japan, believing a new alliance was needed against the rising Berlin-Moscow axis. All that would be needed now is something to spark the awaiting powder keg. Maybe a second Russo-Japanese war, or maybe some conflict over Austria, or maybe some damn thing in the Balkans.